I am joined from Memphis, Tennessee, by a professor of American Studies at the University of Mississippi, otherwise known as Ole Miss. It has nothing to do, this interview, with either of those subjects, though. Unfortunately, as I told Eva Payne here before we went online, I am in love with the South, so we spent a bit of time talking about that. No, we are here to talk about something totally different, which is her book, which came out last year, called, and the title itself is awesome and pretty much tells you everything. It's called Empire of Purity. And I discovered it randomly when I was looking at reviews of just recent history books a couple months ago. And I immediately saw the title and I immediately got it, read it, and then found you online talking about it. And as I just said to you before we went online, I am finishing my book on the history of the American Empire right now. It's in copy edit, and I'm going to condense your whole book into a paragraph and slap it right into my manuscript because it is so important and beautifully argued. And we have to talk about this because my audience and people who consider themselves to be anti-imperialists or critics of the American empire or critics of American foreign policy generally will not know this. I mean,
Mhm.
even I, and I've studied right on where you were, your topic, even I didn't know much of this story that you lay out about, and this is really the middle part of the American Empire, sort of the, I don't know what you'd call it, but we're talking about from the Civil War, and I'm going to let you talk, I promise, between the Civil War and World War II, roughly, that era when the American Empire becomes a global, massive thing that we know today. So, Eva Payne, thank you for being on this show. Uh, Tell us, yeah, let's do the story, the origin story. I know your origin story, but I want you to tell it,
Yeah.
which is important because it begins when you're in college, and I'm a professor, by the way. Yeah, why did you write this damn book?
Well, so the origin story, the kind of intellectual origin story I give for this book starts my first week, my second week of college at the University of Wisconsin, which is when 9/11 happens. And immediately after, we start to hear this rhetoric about how the US needs to invade Afghanistan to rescue women, to save women from Taliban rule, that this is a sort of humanitarian mission. Laura Bush gives a big speech about it. And a lot of feminists get on board and sort of repeat this rhetoric.
Hmm.
And I was really skeptical of this. I was really confused by this language, by how you could justify bombing a country to rescue women. To me, it seemed pretty obvious that that's not what women in Afghanistan had been arguing for in their pretty long-standing arguments for rights.
Wait,
Um,
you didn't understand the long honored tradition in America of killing to save? You weren't
I
to,
didn't. I was
oh,
only 18. I was a baby.
that's what we do.
I was so innocent.
That's what we do in America, Eva. We kill to save.
Oh, it
You
was
should you should read a book or something. This
2001.
is what we
I
do.
mean,
Okay.
yeah, I was just I don't
No, it was
know,
amazing, right? And
listening to my Britney Spears and just
even even Code Pink at one point endorsed the occupation, excuse me, the occupation of Afghanistan to save the
Yep.
women.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but I was unsettled by this. And I think
Hmm.
those questions, this idea that, okay, issues of gender and sexuality are not small, they're not just, sort of private issues. These are the stuff of international politics.
Ha.
That was a big aha moment for me
Whoa.
that I think
Whoa.
that I brought those questions with me throughout my sort of academic
Whoa.
winding academic journey that brought me to my
Whoa.
PhD program where I sort of
Most,
started this as a dissertation.
as I told you, most people watching this are anti-imperialists, I'm pretty sure, or at least fierce critics of American foreign policy. I would bet you that for almost all, or maybe all of them listening and watching, this would never have occurred to them that sexuality has anything to do, and gender has
Mhm.
anything at all to do with foreign policy,
Mhm.
war. What are you talking about? In other countries, right? Yeah, man. It has everything to do with it, it turns out, which I found out in 3 years before you did, in 98 with Kristen Hoganson's book, which was the first attempt to do this,
Hmm.
apply a gender analysis, and she did it to the Spanish-American War, similar to your book, but you go further and do more important work, actually, I think, because you show the institutional legacy of this thinking
Hmm.
internationally. But so, okay, so yeah, everybody listen to this because you guys, you don't, my audience is a little bit on the positivist side, a little hard. I would say it's hard for many people to sort of understand how culture works in politics. And it
Hmm.
ends up becoming material in
Hmm.
reality
Hmm.
because ideas become tanks ultimately, right? They
Yes,
become borders of countries, etc. Go ahead.
absolutely.
And law that governs people's bodies like women. But go
Hmm.
ahead, continue your story, Eva Payne. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think that's it. I think that's the sort of genesis. And then I got to graduate school and someone sort of tipped me off and was like, you should look at social purity reformers. I was like, who? That's the most like ridiculous, boring sounding name I've ever heard. But I'm
Hmm.
going to look at them. And as I looked, I came across these people, and in particular women, like early female physicians who devoted their lives to sort of traveling around the world and actually critiquing imperial governments for how they um, basically created government-run brothels for their troops stationed around the world, and really particularly the British Empire at this point was the main target of their
Yeah,
criticism.
so explain that. This is kind of another thing. Even I was very vague on this, but most Americans aren't aware of this because we have not done this as a country. The British and the French too, I guess. All the
Mhm.
Europe,
Mhm.
did all the
Spanish,
European.
everyone's doing it. Yeah.
So tell us, what was that system? How did they do sex work?
So the system sort of starts, the system as we know it starts in France in the early 19th century. And it's the first time prostitution really gets thought of as a kind of issue of public health and disease control. And so as the system of regulated prostitution gets developed, it varies a little bit, but the sort of basic structures are the government either licenses individual women or brothels, or creates red light districts, right? Areas
Mm.
where women are
Hmm.
allowed to work. And then they register them. There are usually some fees, some taxes, right? The government is getting a cut of this for sure. And then women are required to submit to regular gynecological examinations for venereal disease. And the idea is they'll see if a woman is diseased and then they'll put her in a prison hospital and treat her so that she won't spread the disease to her clients. And then once she's healthy, she can go back to working again. She gets sort of cleared.
Hmm. Hmm.
That said, uh, officials in basically everywhere could just see a woman on the street, decide she's a prostitute, and put her on the registry. And these medical inspections, right, that feels very euphemistic. These are vaginal inspections with a speculum.
Right.
Uh, Many people called them at the time medical rape. They often spread disease, right? They're taking like a one speculum from woman to woman to woman to woman. Um, so it's a very coercive system.
It's state rape.
It's state rape. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And so it's very hard to get off this registry. And so and this becomes sort of imperial policy. This is basically what all imperial powers are doing,
to
and
service
European cities as well.
to so-called service the troops, right?
Yes, and that's very important. There's a clear idea of male sexuality that men, especially sort of soldiers in foreign places,
Hmm.
and there's this sort of, tempted by exotic women who are both beautiful and hideous, uh,
Mm.
need some sort of safe sexual
Hmm.
release
Yeah.
that is not masturbation and not homosexuality. Those are not often stated, but there's always a kind of undercurrent of fear of those. So they
Hmm.
need for their health safe sexual release, and prostitutes provide that. Um, and that's the idea. I mean, the earliest French doctors who sort of articulate this regulation system describe it as a sort of these women are this sewer that directs the like excess energy and like effluvia away from
Mm.
from the respectable women and families, right? It takes
Mm.
all that energy and puts it somewhere else. So they serve this very important social function.
Right. So it's not quite an endorsement, but it's absolutely an acceptance. What's a better word for this? By the state, by national states, right? These are nation states
Yes.
endorsing
Yes.
prostitution
Yes.
and husbanding it, so to speak, right? By regulating it, right? They're the ones distributing it.
Yes.
The state is distributing sex work
Yes.
to service the troops for their imperial projects.
Yes. And they'll say, oh, it's wish we didn't have to do this. It's unfortunate.
Right.
Um, but the idea of, right, like you have to maintain that troop strength. And it's true that syphilis is like and putting a lot of people in
Yeah.
hospitals. So
Yeah,
there
yeah.
is a concern about troop strength. It's just that, right, the way they conceptualize how disease spreads is like prostitutes are the only disease vector, and that's who we have to control. We couldn't possibly
Right.
control men.
So Napoleon is the first to do this, is that right?
Yeah, like the first like kind of imperial, yeah, first
So
imperial.
early 19th century, right?
Yeah.
It's in Europe, they're doing this. And then um and then the story goes until so your story then goes into the late 19th century. So let's talk about what's happening in the United States domestically, which is not the subject really of your book, but let's do this because it's really important. This is what I'm getting at here. The
Mhm,
differences between Europe and the United States
mhm,
on
mhm,
issues of sexuality. Okay, just
mhm.
that broader. What is wrong with us, first of all? But anyway, no, it's just so strange why this people on this land became puritanical in that in those ways. But we did for whatever reason. So so the French and then the British and all the European imperial powers are like basically embracing prostitution in a way, regulating it to make it safe, right? Legitimizing it,
Mhm,
fully sanctioning it. That's the word I was looking
mhm,
for. They're sanctioning it. Meanwhile, in the United States in the 19th century, between the time of Napoleon
mhm,
and the Spanish-American War. We have first in the early 19th century, and this is of course in my book, right? We have kind of the golden age of whores in the United
mhm,
States. They are incredibly wealthy, incredibly
mhm,
powerful. They control politics in multiple cities in the
mhm,
West Coast. They are founding infrastructure projects. They are paying for schools and hospitals, and they're famous.
mhm,
Um, so what happens is the social purity movement arises domestically first, as you well know, right? And what is its aim? Is it to have the state regulate brothels and prostitutes? No. It's eradication and prohibition
mhm,
entirely, right? So
mhm,
right there, we're seeing in the sort of pre-story here, right?
mhm.
The prelude to your story, to the story. This already, we are, what's your amazing phrase?
American
American
sexual exceptionalists. American sexual exceptionalism. Sorry,
um,
I took the words out of your mouth, but I was
I wanted
excited.
you to. Yeah, American sexual accept that is when you that phrase in your book is so because it just brings it all together because our empire, you show,
Mhm,
has been different than all the other empires. We've known this in other ways, right? Less direct colonial control. I mean, some of that, but much less so of like sending troops and then staying there for a century. Less, right? Less direct managerial control of the colonized subjects. We know that. I think that difference is not that important for one thing. This is the difference right
mhm,
here. This is the
mhm,
difference because it proves to me that again, the empire has always been a moral empire and not an
mhm,
opportunistic empire.
mhm,
It's been an empire designed to uplift and change the world in our own image, to remake other people's in our own image, right? It is not the empire of Donald Trump, which apparently is transactional and he can change his mind about principles because he doesn't really have any, which is, I think, actually useful and beneficial in some ways. But anyway, so yeah. And not only is it founded on the empire is founded and established and dispersed on moral grounds, they then, as you then show and tell the story now, they then establish moral reforms in other countries to remake the sexuality of
mhm.
people in other countries, to remake the very sexuality. So, yeah, so take it up from there. Like, where,
Well,
yeah.
I actually want to gently defend social purity reformers
Oh, go
first
for it. I've never heard this.
as
Good.
because the social purity movement as it starts in the US is actually not a movement to eradicate prostitution. It's a movement to eradicate state regulated prostitution. So these people have a real libertarian, feminist,
Oh,
evangelical streak in that they say you can't make laws that come down on women like that. Like the government has no business doing that. That is a complete invasion of civil liberties. Like you can't, it's tossing civil liberties to
well,
the
but
side.
wait,
You
hang on.
cannot do it.
But the social
Uh,
didn't they? But they
social,
closed down all the. But they closed all the brothels, right?
those are that social hygiene. We're kind of like
Oh,
but the 19th century, as the movement sort of starts to get rid of state regulated prostitution, it really does start with a kind of libertarian feminist bent in some ways that say like the state cannot make laws about prostitution because it's only going to harm women.
mm,
And it starts in the US as being very anti-imperial. I mean, people all the time, social purity reformers are saying we cannot, take overseas colonies because standing armies and colonies just lead to regulated prostitution. That we cannot do this for that reason. Like, let the British Empire and what's happening in India with regulated
yeah,
prostitution be a warning to us.
right.
But the movement comes into a closer and closer alliance with the government. And that is the story. And then it sort of becomes social hygiene and becomes a lot more
Prohibitionist.
prohibitionist. Yeah, that's
That's
the
what.
sort of transition from people who call themselves abolitionists because they want to abolish state regulated prostitution, again, because they think it is government
Yes.
overreach.
Right.
And those people, or the most powerful group of those people, are who turn into prohibitionists.
Yeah.
And they draw their kind of moral lineage to the people who are fighting state regulated prostitution. But in fact, what they're arguing for looks a hell of a lot like it, right? It is state control
Yeah.
of women's bodies, just with the difference that prostitution is either criminalized or
But
tacitly legal.
you would say, wouldn't you, that the general national cultures around sex work were radically different
Yes.
between Europe and the United States around that issue about whether
Yeah.
the state should regulate it or ban it outright.
Yes, absolutely. And that's something that Americans were very keen to say. We are a country that does not regulate prostitution. And even, British reformers would say that we have to
Right.
get the United States, we have to get Americans on board our
Right.
campaign to sort of stamp out state regulation
Yep.
because they've never done it on a
Yep.
large scale.
Yep.
Of course, it's like the US hadn't done it on a large scale, not because like Americans were superiorly sexually moral, but because there wasn't like a strong federal government, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
militaries,
Mm-hmm.
outposts had created forms of regulated prostitution. Individual cities experimented with it.
Yeah.
Um,
You could
but
you could get away literally with murder in the United States. John Brown, right? He marched on horseback across country, killed a bunch of people, then marched back, and no one ever arrested him because there were
yes,
no sheriffs,
yes,
because there was no state. There was no
yeah, there's
state,
just not
basically.
infrastructure
Yeah,
in
there was
that
no
way.
state. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Um, do you want to, yeah, so you raised, so the abolitionist term, brought that. So that's another important part of this story. There's a lot here, so I'm trying to piece it together so people get it. Um, uh, your people, these social reformers, these social purity reformers, these anti-prostitution reformers, to a person, aren't they all ex-abolitionists too? Like,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, it's that early the people in the 19th century, um, and there is a sort of transition in leadership around the turn of the century. But the people in the 19th century, they are former anti-slavery abolitionists, right? William Lloyd Garrison is on board with this.
Oh,
They are feminists, they're suffragists, um,
right.
and they
And temperance reformer.
and temperance, yes. And I think they
Mhm.
actually learn strategies from temperance,
Oh
right?
yeah.
When you think about movement across state lines, when you think about the
Mm.
sale of something, you can
Hmm.
start to apply federal law to it.
And more importantly, the demonization discourse, right? The,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
demonization of what they call it, the liquor concern, the liquor or something. There was a name
Yeah.
for the liquor companies that they demonized, and then they started to demonize the pimps,
Yes.
the white slavers,
The white slavers. Yeah.
and then but yeah, yeah. So what do you think about that? Why is this? What's the connection between people? Why would somebody who wants to free slaves want to put women in prison?
I mean, because what I find is that In fact, Northern white abolitionists were talking about prostitution. They were talking about slavery as a sort of sexual system. So they've actually been tuned into sex for a
Sure
while,
were.
and they're
Yep.
focusing on slavery again as a kind of perversion of the family, something that gives masters sexual access to enslaved women,
Hmm.
and that this is polluting the whole South and could pollute the whole country. So
Hmm.
that idea of sexual contagion is there in their attempts to abolish slavery. And then after the abolition of chattel slavery, they're really kind of looking around and saying, like, what's the new slavery? And they land on state-regulated prostitution in the British Empire. And some of what this does is center, right, white women, not entirely white, right, in India, but
Hmm.
often white women as the new kind of deserving objects of rescue. And what it
Hmm.
also does is completely ignore the massive sexual violence happening in the United States at that moment,
Hmm.
right? After the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. So it's a kind of turning abroad and an ignoring of what's happening in the US. But they use this language, right? They call themselves the new abolitionists as a way of kind of drawing on the moral, um, sort of cachet of anti-slavery abolition. But I will say that it's not those exact same people who move towards
Mm.
prohibition.
They're
It's the organizations they found
mm.
start to consolidate and consolidate. It's not really until they consolidate under John D. Rockefeller Jr.
That's the guy.
um, that they really gain the sort of strong carceral edge that they end up with.
Let me I want to just underline what you said about the abolitionists, and then I want to move on to Rockefeller because that's when it gets really good. And people will love to know about Rockefeller. Yeah, you totally stated it correctly. The abolitionists, and this is in my book Renegade History, on my chapter on the abolitionists, they were sexual scolds. They were sexual Puritans of the highest order too. They were actual. Sorry. Okay. I should cut that out. I got a thing in my throat. They were, as you said, primarily concerned with slavery's degrading effects on white people. They considered the South to be a licentious cesspool in which the slaves and the masters and vice versa were just all having sex all the time. Partly true, by the way. There was some of that was not completely wrong, but that was their concern. Their concern, get this, Eva, the abolitionists' concern about slavery is what? That the slaves were too free. As a matter of fact, sexually. They could not limit their passions, they said. And the quotes from the abolitionists, these are the great anti-racists of our time, of that time. And they were absolute anti-racists, but they also thought black culture was filthy and degraded and mostly over sexual.
Mhm.
And so then they come along, and after the war, after they free the slaves, they then move outward, right? And some of them become teachers in the Philippines and schools, but missionaries, right? And then they become your people, right? This now we're talking about them. What I think that tells us is that that's what those people were always concerned with was sexual purity,
Yes. Yeah.
control and order, and not ever freedom of any kind.
No,
So
sort of sexual moral order is
yeah,
really key.
yeah. That's what always motivated them from the 1820s all the way through into the 20th century. That's what it's really been about, not about freedom.
Mhm.
It's an empire of purity, not of liberty.
That is